Hello, and welcome to the Spoonie Authors Podcast, a podcast where we explore a different disabled author's stories each week. I'm your host, Diana Gunn, and joining us today is Dr. Rebecca Gibson. Dr. Rebecca Gibson is a bioanthropology PhD, Corset scholar, and robot sex analyst. Her first book, Desire in the Age of Robots and AI, an investigation in science fiction and fact, is available now. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, Diana. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I am so glad that you are joining us. I'm very excited to talk to you. I'm very excited to talk about your books. So tell us a bit about Desire in the Age of Robots and AI, an investigation in science fiction and fact.
So, this is actually my hobby research. This is something I just did for fun. And I was approached by the very nice people at Palgrave Macmillan to turn it into a book project. And it basically looks at the Blade Runner mythos. So, the novella Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Blade Runner 2049, and sort of unpacks our desire for robot companionship and robot sex, and then looks at like the ethical implications and the physical implications and how we all sort of embody cyborg mentality, especially those of us who are spoonies or have chronic illnesses or are the disabled aspects of things.
Now you're just wondering, when can we replace these faulty body parts?
Oh, seriously. I got interested in this in a large part because I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So all of my collagen is faulty. So I do things like I have a cane, which has a skull head, which is really awesome. And I wear these braces on my hands. But like, you can't be an invisible disabled person when you're doing these things. So I wanted to look at like, where is human enough? When is the advent of this technology a little less human? Where is it a little more human? Where is that intersection of the biological and the mechanical? And specifically how science fiction sort of drives that and reinforces that.
Fascinating. So I guess, yeah, at this point, you know, like every line in Blade Runner from beginning to end.
Basically, yes. I've watched the movie dozens of times. I've read the book dozens of times. I think the second movie was better, and I'm going to get a lot of flack from that. And I think also something I'm going to get a lot of flack from, in no way was Deckard a replicant. No. I have thrown down the gauntlet.
Yeah, sometimes it just needs to be done. I've been doing these interviews in bulk, and yesterday I did an interview and we ended up ranting about certain popular series and fan fiction, and how sometimes fan fiction is better because series break our hearts. You know, sometimes you just gotta throw out the opinion and not care how much crap you're gonna get.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just say, I just noticed your skull earring and it's adorable. I have one quite similar to that, actually.
Thank you. I also am wearing an anatomical heart pin.
Ooh, fancy. I like it. So what inspired you to actually start this project? Why did you begin this research?
So there was a call for papers, and I thought, oh, look, I could do that. And then it just sort of spiraled from there. And I also, I've always been fascinated with what is human and what is not human. And as an anthropologist, this is a lot of the question that we ask is what it means to be human. And so when you look at the Blade Runners and you look at the replicants, you can see that there's this real divide between the two, where you have the biomechanical machine and then you have the human machine, and you have these questions. And if you add sex into the mix, it really captures everybody's interest. And so
sex is good. Sex is capturing most people's interest.
Yes, indeed. So I wanted to write something that would explore this connection we feel with the robots in our lives. We're moving in that direction. We're moving towards a better integration of the cyborg into the human body, and we're moving in the direction of a better acceptance of robot companionship. So, like with Siri and Alexa and all of that stuff. I don't know if you want to mute those trademarked names in your podcast, but with the integration of those types of technologies, we're accepting robots or artificial intelligence as a more everyday thing. And so ethically, I wanted to look at this also because we need to be careful if we're going to design something that could be sentient, that could say, I love you, or that could say, stop this, you're hurting me. We need to figure out how our relationship with those is going to be ethically sound going forward.
Yeah, that's a huge question that is facing us right now. And I think a lot of people don't really think of Siri and Alexa as AI. They think of AI as, the replicants from Blade Runner or as Data from Star Trek. They don't really understand that what is happening in their phones is AI.
Right.
And I think that's actually scary that a lot of people aren't realizing that, and the implications that everyday usage has for the development of AI and the shift in our society.
Yeah, definitely. And the aspect of privacy, we often, I see so many people post on Facebook or Twitter like, oh, I was just talking about something and suddenly I'm getting ads for it. That's not a bug. That's a feature.
Yep.
These companies are doing this on purpose. And we have no reasonable expectation of privacy anymore when we're so plugged into the electronics around us, which is both good and bad.
Yeah, well, it's like the one meme that sometimes goes around where it's like, oh, in, the 1960s, we should be careful talking on the phone. The government might be wiretapping us. And then, 2019, hey, wiretap, how's it? Like, get me a
Yeah.
coffee or something,
Yeah, give me a recipe for pancakes.
Yeah, and I think that is really scary. I understand that, a lot of people don't think about it, but as someone who is queer, who has, who is poly, who has been involved in a lot of things that have at varying points been varying shades of illegal, I'm very aware of the ability of all those things to become illegal again,
Yeah.
and having
Oh,
all
yeah.
of that technology, like I refuse. I understand my smartphone is listening to me. That's fine. There's nothing I can do about that. I need my smartphone for work, but I refuse to have an Alexa
Yeah.
home or a Google Home. I don't want those devices in my home. That's really frightening to me.
Yeah, that's completely understandable. And it's definitely moving further in that direction. Our technology is moving further in that direction. Um, I I don't know what I think about that. I like to do this more as a thought experiment. So far, I'm relatively low tech. I do have the smartphone, I do have the computer, but I also am living on an adjuncts or contingent faculty salary. So it's not like high electronics are really in my near future.
So in other words, not much.
Mm-mm, not much at all.
So we've talked a bit about the book broadly. What is one really interesting fact? I know there's probably about a million, but what is one really interesting fact that you discovered during your research that you would really like to get out there and have be more broadly understood?
So I think that one really fascinating part of this is this focus on emotive AI. So this idea that artificial intelligence relatively soon will be able to sense our emotions through video capture, through voice tone, through the word choices that we make, and to respond in kind. And you see that in Blade Runner 2049 with the character of Joy. She's a pleasure hologram. She is a companion hologram to the main replicant character, KD6 3.7. And she is an emotional mimic for him. She really does what he needs her to do in terms of emotions. So one of the things that strikes me as I look through these data on human relations and why we choose the companions that we choose and what we're looking for in sexual and romantic relationships is this idea that we want someone who's going to give us what we need emotionally. You can't guarantee that with humans. Like living, breathing humans, that's not a guarantee. You can work with your partner, you can collaborate with your partner, you can ask for what you need and refuse to stick around if you get it, but you can't like choose that partner who's going to give you all the things. And so I think as we move more close to actual emotive AI, there's going to be a huge market for companion bots, for robots that will fulfill those emotional needs. I'm not entirely certain, again, what I think about this, whether this is good or bad, because on one hand, it's very important for people to get their emotional needs met, and sometimes that's just not possible for human-to-human interaction. On the other hand, if you don't have human-to-human interaction, if you don't suffer those disappointments, if you don't learn to compromise, if you don't have that give and take of somebody who is going to say no or stand up to you or assert their own emotional desires and rights, you lose a lot of what it means to be a social human being. So again, I'm really split on this. I like to write about it, but maybe not so much to actually make decisions about it.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I've never really thought about it that way. When I think of the dangers of AI and of companion bots, I think this thing's going to be like 2 tons of metal. It's going to be way stronger than I am. If it goes haywire, if its emotions decide all of a sudden it wants to kill me, its programming breaks, I'm
Sure,
dead.
sure.
That's the way I usually look at it. I've never considered it as something that could actually stunt human growth, but you're absolutely right.
I mean, your concern is not out of line. One of the points that I make in the book is regarding the movie Ex Machina.
Oh, I love that movie.
It is a brilliant movie, and I love it to pieces. And there's going to be spoilers in what I'm about to say, but through one scene where Caleb and Nathan are having a discussion, Kyoko, who is a droid, is in the background cutting sushi with a very long, sharp knife. And in a much later scene in the movie, way towards the end, she stabs Nathan in the back with the knife. Same knife. And first of all, that's a wonderful visual duplicating. The movie was beautifully done. But also, you have to think that as he created her, presumably he thought about that programming that would instantiate the ability to cut sushi very precisely. He wrote that into her programming. He failed to write out the use this knife to kill your boss portion of the programming. So when we design these AI, we really need to be conscientious about intended and unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And let me just say, if anyone who is listening to or watching this right now has not watched Ex Machina, you need to stop,
Yeah.
pause this podcast, go watch Ex Machina. It
Oh,
is one of the
yes.
best movies I have ever seen.
So good.
Yeah, it is phenomenal. It is visually stunning, and it has a lot of things like that duplicate you mentioned, and incredible writing.
Yes.
It's
Oscar Isaac's in a role that is just atypical for him, which I love.
Yeah, I could talk about that movie for the whole podcast. It's so good. But I did want to move on because you actually do other work that is really exciting to me as a fantasy author and corset enthusiast. I actually debated putting on one of my corsets for the interview, and then I decided that was too much. Oh, very nice. See, all of mine are full bust corsets, so it's a lot.
Yes.
For listeners, Rebecca is wearing an underbust corset that looks very nice. So your other book that you've written is called The Corseted Skeleton, a bioarchaeology of binding. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and maybe pull one interesting fact that you would love to share with listeners?
Sure. So this book is my actual research, and this comes out of my doctoral dissertation. So I finished the dissertation and graduated in December 2017, and I got this book contract last year in October of 2018. I've finished writing all of it. I'm waiting on photo permissions and stuff to turn it into my publisher. So the book is going to look at the ways that corseting changed the skeletal structure of women from between 1700 and 1900 in a church parish in England, in St. Bride's Parish in London. And I sort of do a massive biological and cultural smorgasbord of research in this. I look at the way women talked about corsets at the time through the magazine discourse. So they would write into magazines and talk about their corseting experiences. I look at how doctors thought about corsets during the day. I look at how laymen thought about corsets during the day. I look at what the women in St. Bride's Parish died of during this time period. And then I look at the skeletons themselves. So I went to London and I also went to Paris, and I looked at the skeletons of women who died during this time period to see if I could find changes to the skeletal structure. So the results are actually already out there in my preliminary paper, so I'm not spoiling anything by saying that the corset does indeed change the body. The human ribcage is generally wider than it is deep. That's why we have that ovoid appearance that we do. And the corseting changes it to a more round structure. It also diverts the spinous processes, which if you run your fingers up your spine, that's what you're feeling. Diverts the spinous processes downward, and they start to overlap each other. So we are seeing distinct skeletal changes. What we're not seeing, and this is the interesting part that you asked about, is we're not seeing shortened lives. We're not seeing an increase of the problems that you hear about when you hear the cultural connotation of corseting that we have here in the 21st century. So you're not seeing massive amounts of skeletal arthritis. You're not seeing livers that were bisected or uteruses that were prolapsed in the causes of death. You're not seeing women who had lived lives of pain and suffering through their own words. And in the causes of death, I looked at 3,851 causes of death, and literally none of them had anything to do with corseting. And this is not the idea that you get from the discourse of the day, where it was very doctor focused, and the doctors were saying, this is a killer, this is a life shortener, this makes women fail to have babies, this is killing themselves for fashion. We're not seeing that in the skeletal records, and we're not seeing that in the archival records of what they died of. They also lived much, much longer than we thought they did. So we hear the cultural construction of the corseted woman as living a relatively short life, dying in her 30s, dying in childbirth, all of these things. In the population that I looked at, the St. Bride's Parish, which is actually a really representative London parish. This is basically your average Church of England middle-class parish. I'm seeing women who are regularly living 45, 55, 65, 85, into their 90s. There's much more chance that a woman from this time period in this parish, which can be extrapolated to the larger London population, is going to die past her 60th birthday than she is going to die in her 30s.
That's fascinating. So what you're telling me is that the doctors were just being alarmist pricks trying to ruin women's fun.
Yeah, actually, that's a really great way of putting it. Women themselves didn't see the corset as being sort of patriarchally constructed. Women had a huge role in continuing to perpetuate this undergarment that lasted for 400 years. They did see a big problem in that doctors and the men in their lives were trying to tell them how to use the garment.
Typical.
Yeah.
Things we still deal with today.
Yes, we do.
So little has changed, and so much. That is really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. So did you just look at that many causes of death, or did you actually look at that many skeletons?
Unfortunately, skeletal material is considerably thinner on the ground, so to speak. No pun intended there. So I looked at about 150 skeletons total, and the women who we know would have corseted, so women of this particular class during this time period in a major metropolitan area like London, uniformly showed the corseting damage, especially as they got older.
Fascinating. So I'm going to bring this back to the topic of the podcast, and ask, what are some of the challenges that you face as a disabled academic and author?
Sure. So the biggest two are energy level and the fact that you can't really, you have to make two choices. You have to either be willing to completely hide your disability, or you have to really embrace it and be willing to out yourself right away. So I'll deal with those in sequence. I am tired all the time. And when you're in academia, your emphasis is on publication, and you need to show up to events, and you need to make friends, and you need to be there and be present in the moment. And diseases that are degenerative and come with a huge fatigue aspect make that really, really difficult. I have to choose very, very carefully which events I attend in my department. Luckily, my department here at Notre Dame is fantastic and accepting, and everybody has been very supportive of whatever it is I need to do to keep myself going. But there are still certain expectations that you're going to be social, you're going to go to cocktail hours, you're going to attend things early in the morning and late at night, when my body is just like, no, we need to not be doing this. We need to be laying down. So energy level is the biggest one. And then I use a cane and I wear these braces, and I'm really pushing hard for the instantiation of a much more robust conversation on Notre Dame's campus about disability and accommodation. Because I can walk with the cane, and I'm in my 30s, late 30s at this point, but I'm in my 30s, and people might think it's an affectation, and whatever, people do things like that, or they may think it's for a temporary disability or something. But the braces that I wear on my hands for the joint slipping that is a predominant feature of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, they look like fancy jewelry. One person recently said they look like bondage jewelry, and I'm like, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I could see that.
They're not wrong.
They're not wrong. But here's the thing: when you walk into an academic interview, or you walk into an auditorium to give a talk, or you walk into a classroom and you talk with your hands a lot, the way I do, the first thing people see is that you're not entirely appropriately dressed for a college campus. This has never particularly bothered me because well, first of all, being an anthropologist, we're all a little weird. And it's sort of expected, and I do my own thing, and everybody around is just going to have to adjust. But I immediately have to out myself, or I have to make the choice to not worry and wonder about whether or not people are going to interpret these the wrong way and think of me as somebody who doesn't know how to be situationally appropriate. So it's out yourself and own your disability, or stay quiet and be misinterpreted. And this is a very bad choice. This is not a choice we should have to make. We should have more discussions about having illnesses and disabilities be considerably more accepted and actually accommodated, actual accommodations, instead of just lip service to them.
Yeah. That is extremely important. And I really hope that you can push those conversations forward at your school, because that really needs to happen. So part of the problem in stuff like this is that people tend to have a very specific image when they hear the word disability.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could touch on what you see in disability representation in the mainstream media and how you would like to see that representation change in the coming years.
Yeah. I would like to see, first of all, more disability categories more diversity categories within the representation of disability. Not all of us are white. Not all of us are pretty. Not all of us are inspirational. Not all of us, all of these things where we're missing out on that representation. And part of the reason that disability is so stigmatized is we see it as something that happens to somebody else. And we don't get that chance to really see it as our own images being represented. And in fact, there's this interesting intersection of disability and queerness that both sort of codes for a lot more attention and yet also an invisibility. And so I'd love to see better representation in those particular aspects. And at the same time, I also would really love to see normalization. Like, we talk about this thing in disability studies, like in the theoretical aspects of disability, about basic universal design. So the amount of design intent that goes into creating materials and structures, and structure, you can take that any way you want, actual buildings or like systematic structures that just make it so that every level of needed accessibility is already there. And then people who need it can take advantage of it. And people who don't need it can, like, I don't know, take the stairs to the 8th floor if they want to. But, we already have the superstructure in place so that the level of ability becomes much less important than the other contributions. There's this normalization of some people are going to need elevators and ramps, some people are not. We're going to build all of this stuff so that whoever needs whatever can have what they need.
Yeah, that is definitely something that I would like to see more of. And I think that specifically is something that science fiction and fantasy authors should be looking at because, we're building our own worlds. Why
Yes.
not build them
Yes,
with that concept in mind?
exactly. I love world building. I'm teaching a class this semester called Sex, Gender, and the Anthropology of the Graphic Novel.
Oh my
And
goodness.
it's so fun. The students are going to write their own graphic novel for the final project. Um,
That's great.
One of the things I'm trying to get them to do right now, we're on week 3. So right now, I want them to think about the world that their characters are going to inhabit and what that world should look like and how they can incorporate this this intersectionality, these areas of privilege that they control and contain, and then areas of underprivilege that they see around them or that they also control and contain into those worlds. And you're right, we should work on this.
Yeah, that course sounds amazing. I wish I could just hop countries and come take that course.
Oh my God, where are you? I didn't know.
I am in Canada.
Oh, well, cheers from the sunny south of Indiana, which is not sunny at the moment.
Yeah, well, that's everything's changing. Weather doesn't mean the same things in places that it used to. Winter here
Accurate.
is not what winter used to be. Um,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is one of the many changes happening in our society right now, is the planet is literally changing around us and we can't really count on.
That's going to be interesting for accessibility access in the next 10, 20 years, is how climate change is going to intersect with things like air conditioning or things like floodplains.
That's something that I actually haven't thought about much either. Probably just because I'm so terrified. Uh,
I'm an academic. We're paid to think. Overthink. We overthink.
Hey, I'm an anxious person. I would love to get paid to overthink. I mean, I'm already doing. Um, yeah, so I think that really wraps it up, though. I mean, I could chat to you forever, but this podcast
Likewise.
could, is only supposed to be so long, and I do have other interviews today.
Yes, of course.
So I am going to bring us to our last question is, where can people go to find out more about you and your amazing work?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at our Gibson girl. I have a Facebook page which I update fairly regularly. It's facebook.com/the corseted skeleton. And my primary email address is rgibson.archeo@gmail.com. That's RGIBSON.ARCHAEO@gmail.com.
Awesome. And do you have an expectation for when the corseted skeleton will come out?
September or October this year. I'm super
All
excited.
right. I look forward to it greatly.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us and for sharing your wonderful insights. It has been a delightful chat.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Spoonie Authors Podcast. The Spoonie Authors Podcast is part of the Spoonie Authors Network, a community initiative devoted to sharing the stories of disabled authors and educating abled people about what life is like for disabled creatives. Transcripts of this podcast are also available on the Spoonie Authors Network. To learn more or become a contributor, visit spoonieauthorsnetwork.blog. And of course, if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast streaming platform.